This man experienced 7 minutes of clinical death, which changed his entire life. What did he see beyond, and what secrets were revealed to him? Watch until the end to discover a story that might change your perspective on life. Michael was born in a small town surrounded by endless fields and dense forests. It was a quiet place where life moved slowly, and everyone knew each other from childhood. His family lived modestly, but the house was always filled with warmth and support. His father, a war veteran, was a symbol of strength and resilience for Michael. However, behind his stern exterior was a man deeply wounded by memories of war. From a young age, Michael gravitated toward his father, listening to his stories with admiration. His father rarely spoke about battles, preferring instead to share tales of camaraderie, loyalty, and the hardships they overcame together. One day, however, he said something Michael would never forget: "Real strength isn't in weapons, it's in protecting the people you love." These words became a guiding compass for Michael throughout his life. Michael grew up as a curious and active child. He loved climbing trees, running through the fields, and exploring the surrounding areas. But everything changed during his teenage years. The sudden death of his mother from an illness was a heavy blow to the family. His father withdrew into himself, and instead of succumbing to grief, Michael decided to become a pillar of support for his younger sister. This was his first real test, teaching him to take responsibility for others. In high school, Michael found his place in sports. He became the captain of the school's football team, known for his perseverance and leadership qualities. His teammates respected him for his ability to pull himself together during tough times and inspire others. Yet, despite his outward confidence, Michael felt an emptiness inside. He was searching for a purpose, something greater than just victories on the field or good grades. The decision to join the Marine Corps came to him unexpectedly, yet naturally. One evening, sitting on the porch of his home, he looked at a family photograph where his father stood in uniform, his head held high with pride. "I want to do something important too," Michael thought. The next day, he enlisted in the military. When his sister learned of his decision, she cried. She was afraid of losing the last close person in her life. But Michael promised her that he would return. "I have to do this to become better," he said, hugging her. His father, silently listening to their conversation, held back his tears, but deep down, he was proud of his son. Upon joining the Marine Corps, Michael began a new chapter in his life. He faced grueling training, pain, and the need to constantly push beyond his limits. Yet he was determined to prove he was worthy of wearing the uniform. Gradually, he became part of the brotherhood, where everyone knew they could rely on each other in any situation. But his journey was just beginning, and ahead of Michael lay challenges that would turn his life upside down. Years of service changed Michael. From a boy full of hope and dreams, he became a hardened soldier who had learned to survive in the harshest conditions. War made him witness blood, death, and pain that could never be forgotten. But it also taught him resilience, discipline, and the ability to make decisions under unbearable pressure. Michael participated in the most challenging missions, saved the lives of his comrades, and carried out orders despite the fear that sometimes gripped him to the core. Michael would never forget his first mission. His unit was sent to a small mountain village to clear the road of mines and assist the local population. The assignment seemed simple but ended with an unexpected ambush. He still remembers how time seemed to slow down when his comrade, a senior sergeant, was seriously wounded. It was at that moment Michael first felt the true weight of war, the responsibility for the lives of others. He gritted his teeth, shielded his comrade with his body, and helped carry him out of the line of fire. This marked the beginning of his internal transformation. Years of service flew by like a flash. Each operation left its marks, not only scars on his body but also deep wounds in his soul. Michael watched as his comrades died before his eyes, heard the screams of the wounded, and smelled the burning metal and gunpowder. He learned to shut off his emotions just to survive. But sometimes, during rare moments of calm, he caught himself thinking, what if tomorrow never comes? One of the most difficult missions was the evacuation of civilians from a village surrounded by militants. Intelligence had reported that the people there were essentially hostages and would not survive without assistance. Michael, as a senior sergeant, was responsible for the operation. He knew there was no room for mistakes. The evacuation began early in the morning. The soldiers worked cohesively, covering each other. Michael led the way, clearing a path through narrow streets that could have been booby-trapped. He remembers locking eyes with an elderly woman clutching a crying child. It reminded him of his own mother, and he felt a surge of mixed emotions, anger and determination. When the group finally reached the evacuation zone, the sound of helicopters filled the air. People began boarding, but the militants opened fire. Panic ensued. Michael covered the retreat, feeling every movement become harder. His shoulder was wounded by shrapnel from a grenade, yet he continued to command. Not a step back. "We'll see this through," he shouted to his troops, pushing through the pain. When all the civilians were evacuated, Michael boarded the last helicopter. He sat by the open door, his hands trembling with exhaustion as blood slowly dripped down his uniform. It seemed like it was all over. But fate had other plans. A sudden explosion. The helicopter shuddered violently, and Michael felt a sharp jolt. A blinding flash filled his vision, followed by silence. He remembered only one thing, trying to scream but hearing no sound. The helicopter began to plummet, and everything around spiraled into chaos. When Michael awoke, everything was on fire. Wreckage, injured comrades, chaotic screams. Michael was pulled from the cockpit just as he was losing consciousness. Moments later, his heart stopped beating. It was the end, or, as he later realized, the beginning of something entirely new. Michael was found among the wreckage, his face covered in dust, his uniform torn, and blood slowly seeping from a wound on his side. A medic who crawled through the debris froze momentarily upon seeing Michael's condition. "We don't have much time." "He's still alive, but his heart could stop any second," the medic shouted to his comrades. They lifted him onto a stretcher carefully, trying not to worsen his injuries. Michael was barely breathing, each breath shallow and labored. The evacuation helicopter finally landed nearby. The war raged on, gunfire and explosions echoed all around, but the soldiers formed a protective line, covering the medics. "Hang in there, Sergeant. We're getting you out," one of the soldiers said, gripping Michael's hand tightly. The helicopter, loaded with the wounded, took off despite continued enemy fire. Inside, tension filled the air, broken only by the sound of medical equipment. Michael lay motionless, his face pale as ash. The medics worked tirelessly, administering adrenaline, applying tourniquets, but their expressions betrayed their desperation. "He's losing too much blood," one of them whispered. Suddenly, the heart monitor emitted a continuous, piercing tone. "Cardiac arrest," a medic shouted, and the helicopter filled with the sound of the defibrillator. One shock. Two shocks. No response. "We're not giving up," the lead medic yelled, ordering them to continue resuscitation. Time seemed to slow. Minutes felt like hours. The medics fought for his life, but there was still no pulse. One of them, wiping sweat from his brow, muttered, "I think we've lost him," but the lead medic refused to give up. "Keep going. We still have a chance." When the helicopter landed at the hospital, Michael had been in a state of clinical death for 7 minutes. His lifeless body was rushed to the operating room. The doctors, prepared for his arrival, immediately sprang into action. The room buzzed with the sound of medical equipment, sharp commands, and the swift movements of the surgical team, all merging into a desperate battle to save a man who seemed to have crossed the threshold of life. Years of service changed Michael. From a boy filled with hope and dreams, he transformed into a hardened soldier who learned to survive in the harshest conditions. War forced him to witness blood, death, and pain that were impossible to forget. But it also taught him resilience, discipline, and the ability to make decisions under unbearable pressure. Michael participated in the toughest missions, saved the lives of his comrades, and followed orders despite the fear that sometimes gripped him to the core. Michael would never forget his first mission. His unit was sent to a small mountain village to clear a road of mines and assist the local population. The assignment seemed simple but ended in an unexpected attack. He still remembers how time seemed to slow down when his comrade, a senior sergeant, was critically injured. At that moment, Michael felt the weight of war, the responsibility for other people's lives. Clenching his teeth, he shielded his comrade with his own body and helped carry him out of the line of fire. That moment marked the beginning of his internal transformation. Years of service passed in a blur. Each operation left its marks, not just scars on his body but deep wounds in his soul. Michael saw his comrades die before his eyes, heard the screams of the wounded, and smelled burning metal and gunpowder. He learned to suppress his emotions just to survive. But sometimes, in rare moments of calm, he caught himself thinking, what if tomorrow never comes? One of his most difficult missions involved evacuating civilians from a village surrounded by militants. Intelligence reported that the people there were essentially hostages and would be doomed without help. As a senior sergeant, Michael was in charge of the operation. He understood there was no room for mistakes. The evacuation began early in the morning. The soldiers worked seamlessly, covering each other. Michael led the way, clearing a path through narrow streets that could have been mined. He remembered locking eyes with an elderly woman clutching a crying child. It reminded him of his own mother, and he felt a surge of mixed emotions, anger and determination. When the group finally reached the evacuation zone, the roar of helicopters echoed above. As people began boarding, the militants opened fire. Chaos erupted. Michael covered the retreat, feeling each movement grow heavier. His shoulder had been hit by shrapnel from a grenade, yet he continued giving commands. Not one step back. "We'll see this through," he shouted to his men, ignoring the pain. Once all the civilians were evacuated, Michael climbed aboard the last helicopter. He sat near the open door, his hands trembling from exhaustion as blood slowly seeped through his uniform. It seemed the worst was over. But fate had other plans. An explosion. The helicopter shook violently, and Michael felt a sharp jolt. A blinding light filled his vision, followed by silence. He only remembered one thing, trying to scream but hearing no sound. The helicopter began to plummet, and everything around him spiraled into chaos. When he regained consciousness, everything was on fire. The wreckage of the helicopter, wounded comrades, frantic cries, it was a scene of devastation. Michael was pulled from the cockpit just as he was slipping into unconsciousness. Minutes later, his heart stopped. It seemed like the end, or, as he later realized, the beginning of something entirely new. Michael was found among the wreckage. His face was covered in dust, his uniform torn, and blood slowly oozed from a wound on his side. A medic who crawled through the debris froze momentarily upon seeing Michael's condition. "We're running out of time." "He's alive, but his heart could stop any second," the medic shouted to his team. They lifted him onto a stretcher, carefully avoiding worsening his injuries. Michael was barely breathing, each gasp ragged and shallow. The evacuation helicopter finally landed nearby. The war hadn't stopped, gunfire and explosions echoed in the distance, but the soldiers formed a protective shield around the medics. "Hang in there, Sergeant." "We've got you," said one soldier, gripping Michael's hand tightly. The helicopter, packed with wounded soldiers, took off under continuous fire. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, punctuated only by the sounds of medical equipment. Michael lay motionless, his face pale as ash. Medics worked tirelessly, administering adrenaline and applying tourniquets, but their eyes betrayed their worry. "He's losing too much blood," one of them whispered. At one point, the heart monitor emitted a long, continuous beep. "Cardiac arrest," the doctor yelled, and the helicopter was filled with the sound of the defibrillator. One shock. Then another. No response. "We're not giving up," the senior medic shouted, urging his team to continue resuscitation. Time seemed to slow. Minutes felt like hours. The medics fought to save his life, but there was no pulse for what seemed like an eternity. One of them, wiping sweat from his brow, muttered, "Looks like we lost him," but the lead medic refused to give up. "Keep going. We still have a chance," he commanded. By the time the helicopter landed at the hospital, Michael had been clinically dead for 7 minutes. His lifeless body was rushed into the operating room. The medical staff, waiting for his arrival, immediately sprang into action. The room filled with the sound of machines, sharp commands, and the rapid movements of surgeons and nurses, all united in a desperate fight to bring him back. Michael, however, saw none of this. For him, time had stopped, and he found himself in another world, a place where everything he had experienced felt simultaneously distant and terrifyingly close. Yet, the battle for his life continued, as if the doctors and medics sensed he wasn't ready to leave. When Michael's heart stopped, he felt everything around him vanish. The pain, the noise, the smells, they all dissolved into an infinite void. The first thing he became aware of was a complete and overwhelming silence. This wasn't the ordinary quiet he had known during nighttime operations. It was an absolute stillness, oppressive and heavy, as though the entire universe had stopped breathing. He tried to understand where he was, but he couldn't move or speak. His body no longer obeyed him, and his consciousness floated in an intangible darkness. Is this the end? The thought flickered through his mind. Yet, instead of fear, he felt a strange sense of calm, as though someone, or something, was holding him gently, preventing him from falling into the abyss. Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the distance. At first, it was small, like a star in the night sky, but it began to grow, spreading across the void. The light was warm and enveloping, and Michael felt his heart, or what was left of it, fill with peace. This light didn't blind him, it drew him in with a force that was impossible to resist. Michael felt his essence, not his body, but something deeper, his very soul, begin to move toward the light. It wasn't like walking, it was as if a current had picked him up and was carrying him gently forward. As the light grew brighter, images began to appear around him. They emerged like scenes from a movie, playing out in vivid detail before his eyes. The first image he saw was his mother. She appeared as he remembered her before her illness, smiling warmly with kind eyes. A surge of emotion overwhelmed him, and he felt a deep ache in his chest, a longing he had buried for years. She didn't say a word, but her gaze was filled with love and forgiveness. In that moment, Michael realized how much he had missed her. The light around him shimmered, and suddenly, a panorama of his life unfolded. He saw himself as a young boy, running through the fields, and then as a teenager, proud of his first victory on the football field. But the images grew heavier, moments when he had been harsh to his sister, when he had failed to call his father, when he had avoided closeness and buried himself in work to escape vulnerability. The most painful memories were those tied to the war. He saw the faces of those he couldn't save, remembered the comrades whose lives were cut short in an instant. These images were so vivid that he felt their pain as if it were his own. As he moved closer to the light, a figure emerged. It was something indescribable, not a man, not a woman, but a being of infinite wisdom and kindness. The figure radiated not just light but understanding, compassion, and strength that words couldn't capture. A voice, soft yet powerful, spoke to Michael. You lived, but were you truly alive? You fought for others, but what did you do for the peace in your own soul? The words echoed in his mind, resonating deeply. Michael felt as if every word pierced through his heart, revealing truths he had long avoided. The figure showed him two futures. In one, he returned to his old life, closed off, distant, unwilling to let anyone close. That path ended in loneliness. In the other, he embraced love, shared his experiences, and helped others find light in their darkness. This path was full of warmth and joy, but it required Michael to be honest and courageous in ways he had never been before. The voice continued, you can return, but only if you are ready to take responsibility. A second chance is not a gift, it is a mission. Michael felt a stirring within him, a growing understanding of what he needed to do. His journey toward the light wasn't easy. It wasn't just an encounter with another world, it was a confrontation with himself, his fears, his guilt, and his dreams. And it was here, beyond the veil of life, that Michael began to grasp what it truly meant to live. Michael felt a jolt, a sudden, electric shock that surged through his entire being. His eyes snapped open, though everything around him was a blur. The sterile smell of antiseptics and blood filled his senses, and shadowy figures moved around him, their voices blending into the rhythmic beeping of machines. He didn't fully understand where he was, but deep within, he knew one thing, he was alive. He's back, one of the doctors exclaimed, his voice filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. Michael, too weak to speak, could only blink. His body felt foreign to him, every movement racked with pain. Breathing was difficult, as if his lungs struggled to accept the air they had been denied. He was wheeled out of the operating room and into the recovery area, hooked to countless machines and IVs. Michael tried to make sense of what had happened. Images flashed in his mind, fire, the helicopter crash, and the light. That light, so vivid and comforting, lingered in his thoughts. The doctors spoke reassuring words, but they barely registered. His mind was consumed by what he had experienced during those 7 minutes. When Michael regained full consciousness, he was surrounded by silence. The only sounds in the hospital room were the soft hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of nurses in the hallway. He stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying everything he had seen. His mother's face. The voice of the light. The choices he was shown. These memories felt more real than the hospital bed beneath him. A nurse entered the room and checked his vitals. She looked at him with a mix of awe and kindness. "You're a miracle, Sergeant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael managed a faint nod, though he had no words to respond. How could he explain what had happened to him? How could he even begin to process it himself? Over the following days, the memories of those 7 minutes became sharper. He recalled the warmth of his mother's gaze, the pain of reliving his mistakes, and the strength in the voice that spoke to him. He realized that the experience wasn't just a vision, it was a message, a calling he was meant to understand and act upon. Michael's recovery was slow and grueling. Each movement felt like a battle, each step a monumental effort. But within that pain, he discovered something new, an appreciation for the sheer act of living. He noticed the way sunlight streamed through the hospital window, the subtle rustling of leaves outside, and even the rhythmic beeps of the machines keeping him alive. Every sound, every sensation felt like a gift. His comrades often visited him during his recovery. One of them, a junior officer who had survived the same crash, sat by his bedside and said, "You saved us out there, Sergeant. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't be here." Those words ignited a spark within Michael, a reminder of his purpose and the responsibility he carried, not just as a soldier but as a person. Weeks turned into months, and eventually, Michael regained the strength to leave the hospital. The day he stepped outside, he stood still for a moment, breathing in the fresh air. The warmth of the sun on his face felt like a blessing, and the distant sound of children laughing brought a rare smile to his lips. Everything seemed brighter, more vivid. He wasn't just alive, he was fully present in the moment, something he had rarely felt before. As Michael adjusted to life outside the hospital, he began to reevaluate everything. He reconnected with his family, writing a heartfelt letter to his sister, apologizing for the years he had been emotionally distant. He visited his father and, for the first time in many years, embraced him without hesitation. "I'm proud of you, son," his father said, his voice thick with emotion. Those words, which Michael had longed to hear since childhood, filled him with a deep sense of peace. But Michael knew his mission wasn't just about healing himself. He started visiting veteran support centers, sharing his story with others who had faced similar struggles. He spoke about the trauma of war, the weight of guilt, and the importance of finding meaning in life after tragedy. His words resonated with those who felt lost, offering them a glimmer of hope. Michael's story began to spread. He was invited to speak at schools, community gatherings, and even televised events. Each time, his message was simple yet profound: life is a gift, and every day is a chance to make it meaningful. Don't wait to tell someone you love them. Don't wait to forgive. Tomorrow isn't guaranteed. One of Michael's most emotional speeches was to the families of fallen soldiers. Standing before them, he said, "Those who have left us don't want us to live in pain. They want us to live with love, to carry their light forward." His words brought comfort to many, reminding them that even in loss, there can be a way to honor those who have passed. Michael himself lived by those words. He no longer delayed calling his sister or meeting up with friends. Every morning, he woke up with the intention of making someone's day a little brighter. He mentored young soldiers, helped veterans cope with PTSD, and volunteered for programs supporting military families. He often said, "Life isn't about a list of goals or achievements. It's about how we touch the lives of others." At one of his final public talks, Michael addressed the audience with these words: "I don't know why I was given a second chance. But I know this: I have no right to waste it. I came back to share this light, to remind you that your life is precious, that you are needed, that you are loved. Find that light within yourself and share it with the world." The room fell silent, not with emptiness, but with understanding. People rose to their feet, applauding, and many approached Michael afterward to thank him. He knew his message had reached them, and that knowledge filled him with purpose. Michael's story reminds us all that life is fragile yet profoundly valuable. No matter what you've been through, there is always a chance to find the light within yourself and let it shine for others. His journey beyond and back is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love, forgiveness, and purpose. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and click the notification bell so you don't miss more inspiring stories. Share this video with someone who might need it. It could help them find their own light. Thank you for watching.